welcome to the next episode of the ArtThropologist, where we talk about arts, culture, anthropology, and everything in between and how it all connects. And I am Emil Wilson. I am here with Kristen Brandt.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Well, this is exciting. I'm excited to see your work. I got a sneak peek of the gallery space as it was being hung. And before we get into that, I want to hear a little bit about what you do. What's the day job that pays the bills?
So I work for the Mississippi Arts Commission. I am the arts industry director there, which means I manage a portfolio of grants to support artists and arts organizations and arts programs across the state.
That's awesome. Arts industry. So is yours very focused on grants, or like an arts industry director sounds like?
So arts industry manages single discipline arts groups. So it's more of put in, as opposed to community-based arts organizations like a community theater. This would be more your visual arts museums, your symphonies, organizations that are focusing on a single discipline art form, rather than, say, an arts council that's very community-based, might have an all-volunteer board and no staff. And works with various disciplines based on the needs of the community in which they're situated. So those organizations operate so differently that we find it very useful, not just for us, but for our panelists and for our applicants, if those types of organizations are grouped together.
That's awesome. And how many artists are repped or get applicants? Like, what's the scope and footprint?
We probably receive about 400 applications, a little north of 400 applications a year, and we usually fund about $1.2 million in support across the state. So we're a statewide arts organization.
That's awesome. Very cool. And you are an artist yourself.
Yes, and I don't think that is a title I would have claimed when I started at the Arts Commission. I don't know if it's being steeped and inspired by all of the artists that I've worked with throughout my last 8 years or so working with MAC in one capacity or another. I've had 4 different jobs at the Arts Commission.
Well, so that's interesting. You didn't think of yourself as an artist when you came here.
Right. I was fresh out of grad school. I got my master's in folk and traditional arts at Western Kentucky University, and I was focused on narrative. And if you had asked me when I was in high school or in undergrad, if you were going to engage in an arts practice as an adult, what would it be? I would have said, oh, I'm going to write. I'm going to be a writer. And that's so amazing because I love books and I love reading and I love the universes that writers create. And that might be something in my future, but that's not what I'm doing right now at all.
That's really cool. You went a completely different direction.
Yeah, and it's really kind of started in the pandemic years when we all had a little bit too much time inside and I needed to find something to kind of keep going and find something to hone and do inside. And one of those activities that I started with was a tabletop role-playing game group. We play Dungeons and Dragons every Monday and have for the last 5 years, this same group. And they were my pod during the pandemic years. And I started drawing portraits of us, the kind of more representative of us as we are in real life, but also pictures of our characters and the creations that we played and during our sessions together. And I love the collaborative storytelling element that comes with playing these games.
Yeah, that's something that people don't think about. Is if you're not involved in a role-playing game, those are narrative-driven. They're very story-based. They're not just hang out and roll the dice. There's a narrative to them.
There is, and the only person who really knows where the end of the story is going to be is your game master. And I was lucky to have my best friend of 20 years be the person who introduced me to tabletop games. We played Dungeons and Dragons, but we've also played a lot of other games like Werewolf the Apocalypse or Vampire the Masquerade or even one called Lancer, where you play giant robot mech suits.
Nice, nice. And so, do you do the game master side a lot?
I do. I have started picking it up, partly out of pity for forcing my friend to do all of this work so that we get to have fun every Monday. So I do want to trade off. I've ran this past fall a campaign with a book from Free League Publishing that situates Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition into the world of Middle Earth. So it was a Lord of the Rings role-playing tabletop adventure that went several months, where my characters were returning the youngest Ent in Middle Earth, who had never been to Fangorn Forest, to the forest of his fathers. So it was a very interesting storyline, and we got to play that for months, and then I got burned out for a little bit and wanted to focus on doing some more art, so I stepped back and let someone else take over, and now my spouse is running a short session for us. So it's been really great to see how each of us engage in leading the story, as well as how all of us adapt to different characterizations. And it's really improvisational theater as you go, and the story can change in an instant. It's so much fun.
That's great. And I want to get to what I was actually talking about, which is your art show that's opening this week. But I'm really fascinated by the gaming culture that came or served as the basis for the art you're creating.
Yeah, so I like I said, I started with portraits, and they weren't great. They got better as I went on. I kept all of the old ones. I have binders and binders of sheets of paper and plastic sheets that I've kept, and it's really encouraging to see how much better I got over 3 years of drawing very regularly. And I think it does help that I was drawing the same few people over and over, so I got to know those faces very well. So there's probably 3 Alices in the show in total, but they're all very different. And part of what makes them different is that about 2 years ago, I started embroidering, and I wanted to grow that side of my arts practice a little more. And so I kind of married the two. I started embroidering the portraits that I had drawn during the pandemic.
And so your art show is really, would you call it mixed media? Would you call it fabric art? How would you describe your work?
It's part fiber art and part kind of illustrative drawing, because none of the fiber art pieces have drawing elements beyond the basis of the design. The portraits themselves are embroidered almost and assembled almost into a single patch, and then I quilt a background for them. And I don't know how to quilt, but I make it look like I do, I think.
So you're really self-taught, whether the quilting, the drawing, it's all self-taught.
Yes, I did learn embroidery. I was first introduced to it through my grandmother. My paternal grandmother taught me to sew when I was young. We would use her flip-top sewing machine, or she was very into hand embroidery as well, with kits and things like that. She made placemats for us, and she learned from her mother, who was a very avid quilter. And I discovered that as I have gone through a lot of the closets and things at my grandmother's home, there were about 25 quilts that my great-grandmother had made that had been collected into these cabinets. That have been kind of an amazing discovery. And I did include one of those quilts in the show, because I felt like discovering more and more about that side of my family and finding out how many of my great aunts also sew and do hand embroidery really made me feel like I was connected to this longer lineage of fiber artists. And that whole side of my family is from Alabama, but I'm really excited to see them come to the show as well.
Oh, and I mean, I grew up in the South. Fiber art and embroidery and quilting are such an important part of the culture here. You had that passed down. How old were you when you first really started learning how to sew?
my grandmother was very into hand embroidery when I was very young. I don't remember exactly when she first tried to get me to do that or what age I was. I do remember how it went. And it was almost like my grandfather teaching me how to fish. It was, help, I have a tangle here and I don't know what to do. I was, easily frustrated, short attention span kid who probably didn't appreciate how much was trying to be shared with me at the time. But we had little projects. I have some pillows that I embroidered with her that I still have. But I didn't really stick with it at all. I do think that without that foundation, though, I might not have really continued or even thought to have pursued this as a discipline. My maternal grandmother passed during COVID, and when we went to clean her house for sale, one of my aunts said, Kristen, you're crafty. You take all of this. Take her sewing stuff, because my maternal grandmother would sew my mother and my aunt's clothes. She was very thrifty like that, and she was very good at it. And I knew that I wasn't ever going to really be able to make clothes. That wasn't really a direction I was interested in. But I thought I could do something with it. And so I took home all the supplies, buttons and needles and everything. A really dangerous pin cushion that was full of hidden sharps. But I was able to kind of sort everything out and figure out what was there. And during that process, my other grandmother and I went shopping, and she found this denim jacket and we bought it. And I just saw this blank canvas in front of me and thought, well, it would be kind of fun to put some patches on this. Why not? And I think I have probably about 85 patches on this jacket.
Yeah, it's customized, I think is the best phrase for it.
Yeah, it's the best of punk nerd aesthetic, I think.
Punk nerd aesthetic. And so that's actually kind of the best description of your work. It's all this pop culture stuff, but it's embedded with and created with such this folk art style. So it's very much a pop culture meets folk art.
So I actually really appreciate that, because there's a lot of discussion on whether fan art is folk art or whether cosplay is folk art, and the definition of what is folk art is a very slippery thing to get into. It's a moving target, and there's a lot of elements that folk art and fan art have in common. They're very deeply rooted in community, and the techniques and practices and ways to accomplish your goals are almost always spread person to person, either online or in person. There's usually an intense amount of community around it, but a lot of folklorists think that if it's centered around a fictional character, then it's not really centered around a community idea or something that's, significant in that way. And I can see that perspective as well.
Well, I think there's a question about when does something transcend from pop art or pop culture to folk art, folk culture?
There is a media arts professor who in the 80s and 90s was doing a lot of studies into fan fiction. That's Henry Jenkins at MIT. And he said that fan fiction is a way of culture repairing the damage done in a system where contemporary myths are owned by corporations instead of the folk. And I think that expands into a lot of fan art as well. So a lot of what fan fiction and fan art do is they take these mainstream narratives and they find out where you as a person fit in it. And I think that there's a lot of fan fiction that you'll see where characters might change their sexual attraction or change any number of things about that character to make it fit more with the community that is not being represented by mass media.
So, and there's this interesting argument that pops up constantly about fan art and intellectual property. And I think one of the things that so much of the Dungeons and Dragons pop culture has just embraced fan art. It's not fought it. It's said this is This is part of our narrative and our story. And it sounds like that might tie back into Dungeons and Dragons, the dungeon master, the game master, like that's built into the system.
Yeah, and there's a lot of characters and creatures in Dungeons and Dragons. There's bestiaries out there that you could look at, but there's not necessarily for every single creature an image that is, this is the image. Whereas when you're watching a TV show, say SpongeBob SquarePants, SpongeBob always looks the same. That image is licensed, it's trademarked, but if you say, I made an owl bear, that's your interpretation of a creature that they ripped out of somebody else's mythology book, I mean, these are pieces of folk culture that have been moved into a system that has been commodified, but in a way that allows the players to have access to and change and manipulate that any way that you want. There's rules in the rule book. They don't have to be enforced at your table. You're the game master.
And so you've got this community that you're working with here that are the gamers and all that. Do y'all do the convention circuit? Do you do the pop culture cons and things?
I like Mississippi Anime Fest a lot. Mississippi Comic Con is coming up here in a few weeks. Those are really fun. I've never traveled to go to a con. I think that large amounts of people stress me out. And if I'm going to travel to a convention, there are things that I really like. I love seeing the artist alleys, but a large part of those conventions can be, just commodification of characters, and it's just
pay for an autograph.
Yeah, come pay for an autograph. If you're not interested in seeing a specific celebrity or interested in getting a specific item, a lot of those venues are places for you to pay money to get in, to pay more money to buy things. And there's a lot of other cons. I think they do a really great job of building community and having activities and things to do together, but it's not necessarily the part that I get drawn into.
So how have you been able to share your art?
This is my first exhibition. It's a solo exhibition, so this is a new venture for me. When the applications for exhibits at the Art Center opened in November, I had 2 coworkers who had previously participated in shows there who really encouraged me to just put my name out there and try to see what would happen. And so I'm figuring this out as I go. Before the show, I'd never cut a mat board or, I didn't know how to display my patches that I've created on a wall. I had to kind of figure out how this might work and how this might look as an exhibit, as a collection of itself. And that's kind of how I think about it as a collection. I have trouble letting go of them. I've done, some commissioned pieces for people who have, themes that they work with that they really want and they can't find media for because they're not popular characters, or it's an older show and nobody's making stuff for this. Like, I had somebody from Wisconsin that I've never met before find me on Instagram and ask me to make them a Trogdor patch from Homestar Runner. And he had this awesome jacket. It's all covered in dragon patches. And he was like, nobody makes this. I can't find anybody to make this. And I was like, I will do this. I will take this on for you.
Nice.
So I sent that out. I've done some local commissions for people who wanted to give, gifts, but beyond that, I've mostly just been focused on making as much as I can for the show. And I am in 2 years, I've made about 91 patches. And in the last year, I've made 8 embroidered portraits.
That's awesome.
So lots of sewing, and it's all sewn by hand. I don't use a machine. So even the quilted part that's the background is sewn by hand. Yeah, I love the stabby crafts. They're kind of rough on your fingers, but in a very rewarding and cathartic way.
That's fair. That's fair. It's physical. You really see something developing as you're working on it.
Yeah, and I've gotten faster, and it's a little distressing, the smaller pieces, how fast I go through them, because now I have to come to the next idea, but I don't think I'm ever going to run out. I have a unique system of binders. I don't know if it's the 90s kid in me that had all the binders for school, and I've just never given up the binder. But I have
man, the
idea
Trapper
binders.
Keeper. That's
Yes,
the jam.
I have some still. I held on to them.
I wish I'd held on to more. Like, now, having kids, you want them to have the same experiences of crazy, wild trapper keepers. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So how does it feel with having the shoe on the other foot? You've been working for the Arts Commission and guiding artists through so many of these processes. How's it feel to be doing it yourself for the first time?
Part of me is really grateful that the position that I've had at MAC has connected me with artists who do work really well and very professionally. It gave me an idea of what I needed to be shooting for, in terms of what I need to be producing. And if I want to order prints, what should those look like? If I want to set a table up at a market, this is how it could look, and how I can administer a payment system, and how I can advertise. So I think that I've done a lot of outreach in the lead up for this show, and I hope that people show up. I've had a lot of support from artists that I've worked with at MAC who have kind of recognized what I've been working on, and I don't know that they understand the extent of what I did. There's about 70 pieces in this show.
And I mean, looking at these, hand stitching these, it takes a lot of time. I can only imagine. Right.
It really does. I think one of the portraits I was able to do in about 10 days, including the background, and that was the one of my grandmother and her cat Baker. But I also think I was just very much feeling the pressure because I only finished it about a week and a half ago.
Fair enough, but hey, at least it's finished in time.
Yeah, finished in time, and it worked out. I like to try to find a background that fits the person that's depicted. So the one that is the backdrop for my grandmother's portrait is a quilt pattern called Grandmother's Flower Garden. She was very big into flowers in her garden, and she still is. It's, an eternal gift that I keep this relationship with her, and that I've gotten to share this with her. She asks, every time I see her, she's like, what are you working on now? She keeps me to task.
Why do you think quilting is such an enduring art form? I mean, at a certain point, you have a stash of your great-grandmother's quilts, or so many of them. Why do we keep doing them? It's not just for warmth at this point.
Well, I've seen a huge rise in art quilts in the last, couple decades or so. I've seen a lot of quilts that have always been hung on a wall and never put on a bed, which I think is interesting, because you're taking this utilitarian object and making it an aesthetic piece, these are amazing pieces. I would be scared to sweat on them too, so I don't blame you for putting them on the wall at all. But I do think that there's a certain nostalgia with that symbol of comfort, this sense of handmade quality, something that you can't get out of any store that's just totally unique. And, when you're a child and you're given a baby quilt, often that's something that people hang on to and might pass on to their own kids. It's an enduring object in a way that a lot of material culture may not be.
And, it's such a good tactile sensation making. And even when I had an office job, I knitted a lot. And there were a whole bunch of us that were men who would sit there and knit and do stuff just to keep our hands busy because we were so miserable just sitting. It was the weirdest thing. You'd walk in, because that's not something you associate with being a part of Southern male culture. But I mean, where I was college, we had football players, everybody was just sitting there knitting, and one of the girls had started it, and we all sitting at a call center were like, man, this is
It only
It's
takes
actually
one.
fun. It
only takes one. It's so funny to me. I take small embroidery kit with me everywhere I go, which is very handy when I wind up in the ER and have to sit there for 9 hours and have something to work on. But also if I'm waiting for an oil change, I always have something to do that's not picking up my phone and looking at stuff and just kind of doom scrolling my time away. I feel like I'm doing something productive that makes me feel good, that I have control over, which is an illusion, but it's there.
So, and yeah, that distraction from the phone, because right now, I'm talking about a college experience that's 20 years old. Now, people just sit there and doom scroll all the time, everywhere.
And I think it's fun that you mentioned being at a call center and knitting, because if you talk to me on the phone at Mac, I'm probably sewing while I'm talking to you. Unless you hear my keyboard going, I probably have something in my hands.
Nice.
No one on Zoom needs to know what anything below my collarbones are doing anyway.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The amount of Zoom meetings that have been held pantsless, that's just part of the game now. So, now, had some interesting stories about some of the pieces.
Yeah, there was one, it was about 5 months after I had first started embroidering, and it is the cat from The Last Unicorn, the film adaptation of Peter S. Beagle's wonderful fantasy novel. And I call it the cat because they never gave the cat a name, not in the book, not in the film, it's just the cat. And in the movie, they made him a pirate for no good reason, but I stand by that decision. It was absolutely magical. And so I made this cat, and I got to the point where I've cut it out and I'm about to stitch the border, which is whip stitch over the edge, so you get that kind of fully covered in thread experience. And it fell out of my pocket when I was walking to my car in downtown Jackson, and I was pretty certain it was gone forever, and I was pretty upset about it because I thought I had done a really good job. And it even glowed in the dark. I do a lot of glow in the dark. One of my coworkers, Maria, I was joking with her that I should put up lost cat posters around. And she said, "Why don't you?" I was like, "Why don't I? You're right. Why don't I?" And I did. I put them up in the elevators in the Wolf Oak building. And about 5 hours later, I got a phone call and somebody had found it blocks away down by the Regions Chick-fil-A, and she came and she brought it back to me, and the cat returned, and I never did whip stitch the edge. It's still not whip stitched. I was just so happy to have it back that I kept it in its kind of base state. And there was another one, was a Lady Rainicorn. It was the biggest patch that I had made so far. It was about 5 inches long, but it was a U-shaped 5 inches, so it was really 10 inches of stitching. And it was with my least favorite thread. It was this fluorescent UV thread that glows in black light. And it looks so great, but it feels like you're sewing with a recycled plastic Walmart bag. The texture's not great. It's really hard to work with. But I'd gotten all of that done, and again was on the whip stitching step. And I was walking around for Governor's Arts Awards, which is a program that we run every February here. It's a very busy day. Had no business to be sewing in the elevator, but I was. And when I got off on my floor, I dropped it down the elevator shaft.
Oh.
And it took me about 6 months to start over and redo it.
I'm surprised you didn't just get maintenance, like to go in there and retrieve it.
Well, eventually those elevator shafts were flooded because the water main burst, and then we moved buildings, and it's the universe has taken this flying unicorn into its care.
The universe needed its flying unicorn back.
It did.
Yeah. Trust me, my daughter's got several flying unicorns somewhere in her mind. This probably transplanted there.
Yeah, it's been a really rewarding experience for me, and honestly, when I filled up my jacket full of patches that I got from artists all over the world, I really loved this idea of this kind of collaborative piece that I assembled. I had been stitching those on by hand, and I was looking at patches and I was thinking, there are people and characters that I really like that haven't been done at all. And maybe they're just new, maybe they're obscure. So I started playing with the idea of trying to hand sew my own patches. And I just dove in and started doing it with the wrong materials and poor technique, but it really captured my interest, and I have kept going with it. I don't know that I've gone more than 3 days without sewing in 2 years.
Wow.
So it's been a really kind of permanent part of my last couple years' experience. And there are some kind of like internal rules that I've tried to follow with what I select and how I pick what I do. If you look at it all together, you'll kind of notice they're all animals. Like none of them are characters from the shows that or video games that they're referencing. And I liked that. It almost felt like my own personal little bestiary of creatures. And what I'm very interested in is the world building of it all that goes into these shows. Yeah, the people, they always look like people almost. But the creatures that they insert are what really makes those universes distinct and interesting. They create their own little biology. And for the viewer to really get immersed in this being a strange and different place. And one of my favorite quotes from Ursula K. Le Guin, who I do have a portrait of in the show. There's a lot of portraits of authors that I really like and connect with. That fantasy is escapist in its nature. And I agree with that. There's plenty that you get out of having that escape to new perspectives. And my thesis advisor, when I was going through my master's program, gifted me a book when I graduated. I believe it was either Farmer Joseph Ham or Smith of Wootton Major, by J.R. Tolkien, who's an author that we both really, really love. And she wrote in an inscription in the cover, because we share secondary worlds. And that's almost become a little mantra for me, trying to figure out what I share with people around me, where our secondary worlds might intersect. So I stitched that phrase in her handwriting on my jacket, and it's also printed on the wall of my show.
I love that description of all of these places as secondary worlds. Like, it's a community that you've created, that you share with others. And I think that's one of the things that makes fantasy so enduring, is that it intersects with our world enough that you can share it with others.
It's this delightful, speculative, this but, or what if this instead? How might we twist this and make it not a mere reflection of what our experience is, but show something about what we experience through something that's totally different.
Well, that was something that always struck about Tolkien, was his utter opposition to allegory. And then he writes something from which everyone is drawing their own allegories from. And so maybe that is why he was so opposed to it, is he didn't love that one-to-one correlation. He was looking at a one to infinite combinations. And
Tolkien is such a special writer for me. I love the other books that he wrote in addition to The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is my favorite out of the three, out of the four really main books. But he also did these amazing children's books for his kids, like Roverandom.
I was just thinking of Roverandom.
Roverandom, so sweet. I mean, your son loses his favorite dog Stuffy on the beach, and you write this whole narrative about the adventures that your Stuffy goes on, and he goes to the bottom of the ocean and he meets a moon dragon and a wizard, and of course he comes home eventually, but it's just so sweet. And he's creating this other world for his kid. He wrote The Hobbit for his kids, really, and I think that he never probably anticipated how big that would grow.
Well, and even you mentioned the Smith of Wootton Major. That it's such a good story, and I feel like it gets overshadowed by The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, which, I mean, yes, those are epics. Those deserve the spotlight, but there's something just quaint and lovely about the stories and the worlds that he builds, like Smith of Wootton Major, that have nothing to do with what we think of as the Tolkien work.
There's a short story he wrote called Leaf by Niggle, and it is a really great kind of representation of the experience of creating art in a lot of ways. It is this guy who is spending his whole life painting one tree, and he's just niggling over the leaf by leaf and, never really making much progress and just being so meticulous. And that's how Tolkien wrote. He wrote from the big to the little. He saw this giant mythos and legendarium that he wanted. He had a language. He wanted a world for that language to exist.
Right. I mean, who creates the language first?
A philologist.
A philologist, of course. Yes. And I mean, and that was always his criticism of Lewis was, well, what's the language of Narnia? Saying, who cares? But
he also didn't like Santa Claus being there either.
I mean, that's fair. That's fair. So, and I think about the philology, and this is why we call the show the ArtThropologist, and it's the way that art weaves all of these things together. Philology and the study of language is what gave rise to this entire epic world that is the world of Tolkien.
And a lot of people don't realize this, but Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were, professional librarians. They were studying the German language. They were philologists. They were trying to make a German language and grammar, and part of that was collecting stories.
Which again ties back
to that's what they're known for.
Well, and that ties back to what we were talking about earlier. They were collecting what we think of now as folk art, but at the time, what's the difference between pop art and folk art? People sitting around telling stories. Well, it is what's pop. It is what's popular. But then it gets handed down, and at a certain point, the popular becomes the folk. So,
for a lot of folklorists, the distinction would kind of be that the ownership of the tradition, the ownership of the kind of origination of these traditions is insular within a community and stays with that community. For a lot of popular culture, it's starting out as something that's commodified, but might be based on something that is folk. So if you think about Disney's Cinderella, that is a folk tale that they have taken, commodified, and packaged into one version of this story. And it becomes the version because it's Disney. But for folk tales, even kind of now, they change telling to telling. They change based on what audience you're telling it to. You're going to never be able to tell one story the same way twice because you're going to be interacting with your audience, figuring out what's resonating with them and adjusting your repertoire accordingly.
So I have to ask, because so much of your work is creation of pop culture that then gets shared around inside of those pop culture communities. And one that speaks to me and to my childhood is from The Labyrinth. Mm-hmm. And you think about Jim Henson, you think about Tolkien or Lewis and these epic world builders. Is there a point, maybe 100 years, at what point does the world creator, like Jim Henson or Tolkien, turn into a folk creator?
Well, I think for folktales specifically, there's not really one author. Something that is created as a literary story has a known single author and a known single version. And Tolkien, he published revisions throughout his life.
Sure.
We're gonna ignore that. But it's this one static version that doesn't change. If you read The Lord of the Rings today, you could go buy 5 different copies at 5 different bookstores. It's the same copy of The Lord of the Rings.
But what role would fan fiction play in shaping that kind of for future generations?
See, I think fan fiction fascinates me on so many levels, and I never really read much fan fiction before the last few years, and I've actually gone through and read and listened to. I can't read while I sew, so I put on audiobooks. I've gone through all of the Earthsea books, and right now I'm listening to the Overstory by Richard Adams. But I also listen to several long-form fan fictions. And the way that those stories are created, again, it's written by one author, but it is taking a story that, again, was packaged for mass enjoyment and kind of to serve the dominant cultural group and reshifting the lens to maybe a more marginalized culture group who is not representative in the mass media and how it was originally created. So I think that the changes that fan fiction writers make very much serve a purpose, and the ones that get very popular within certain communities, they're hitting a purpose that resonates with a lot of people.
Well, and that's something when you go to these conventions, when you see the overtaking by Marvel, which is this big corporate behemoth. But I heard someone just say that what's interesting about the pop culture cons and things now is that it's like the nerds have taken over society. And they weren't saying that in a sort of a negative way.
Nerds are compassionate and creative people.
Well, I was a Star Trek nerd. Like
I love Star Trek.
I went to the Star Trek conventions and as a kid and all it. But now, pop culture is not just it's not just the world of dime store novels. Like, it's really become the corporate driving force to so many industries now. Even movies are no longer, Annie Hall. The driving force of the economics is Marvel and DC, and it is fan fiction. Do you think fan fiction is part of what's driven that cultural shift?
I think that social media has in a lot of ways, because you are able to share these individual fan-made creations to a larger group of people, because you might be the only person who likes one piece in a 50-mile radius, but if you put that on Instagram or Reddit or somewhere else online, you're going to meet thousands of people who enjoy the thing that you do. I think that the internet and social media have given a wider range of people to find community with individuals across the planet who already have an interest in what they're doing. You don't have to convince your friends to watch the show that you love. There's someone out there, probably hundreds of them, that are already interested in what you're interested in. And you can find those people.
And you're finding them and making art for them.
Yeah, I think what attracts me most to fandom culture is people's enthusiasm. I love watching people get excited and seeing what really triggers that for them. I love handmade things. I love things that are nerdy. That's how these things kind of came together for me. And it's been an experience that I find really rewarding, and every patch that I have either given as a gift or sold as a commission, they always seem so excited. They always seem so grateful for having something that they wouldn't have been able to find in the mass-produced kind of merchandise culture.
Well, I know it's patches, but is that necklace yours?
It is. So I wanted to try to find another thing to sew that wasn't patches, that wasn't, I have to cover 100% of the surface of this piece of felt. So I do on like crushed velvet or suede, small micro embroideries, and then I put them on wood-backed pendants. So I've done a lot of those. For the show, I made about 30. And I say made as if it's in the past tense. I have to assemble them all still, but I finished the sewing part.
Well, the show is in 2 days, so you have plenty of time.
Well, I mean, I have the whole midnight release of the Nintendo Switch 2 tonight to, I have to stay awake somehow.
Love it. Love it. Now, where is the show taking place?
It's at the Art Center in downtown Jackson, next to the planetarium and the art museum. The show opens on Friday. There's an artist talk between 6 and 7. But please come out and see it. I'd love to share with you the things that I've made and hear about what interests you.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And how can people get in touch with you, see your work?
So I am on Instagram at Everyday Psyche. Everyday spelled normally, Psyche, Psyche. One of my favorite stories or types of tales. There's an index of folklore stories called the Aaron Thompson Uther Folklore Index that tells you different motifs and story structures, just kind of cataloging all that. My favorite is ATU 425 A through C, which is the kind of Beauty and the Beast story format, and Cupid and Psyche is one of my favorite versions of that story. It's got this really interesting adventure where the female character is the one who goes on an adventure. It's an adventure of, I'm sorry, I messed up, but it's still an adventure, and she got to end up being a goddess in the end. So
that's awesome. That's the best way to end an adventure. So
yeah, I don't think anybody's ever understood my Instagram handle, but because I like folklore, things that are happening in the everyday people's lives. So I kind of married Everyday with Psyche, one of my favorite stories, and that's how I came to my username.
Love it. Love it. So thank you. I think that's a good time and place to wrap up. We're getting close to the end of the day, and I know we are in a state building, so we should probably get out. So thanks, Kristen Brandt. This is Emil Wilson with the ArtThropologist, encouraging you to look for the arts. The arts are everywhere. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the ArtThropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm the ArtThropologist.